That night, crystal chandeliers trembled slightly from the laughter of powerful men. Champagne flowed like truth usually does, slowly, and only for those who matter. And standing near the entrance was a woman everyone ignored. She wore a plain black dress. No diamonds. No introductions. Just quiet dignity. Beside her stood a man smiling too hard, a man who whispered, "Just stay close, and don't embarrass me." They thought she was a maid. But when the room finally fell silent and the company's real owner was announced, every heartbeat in that hall stopped. Because the name they called belonged to her. And in that moment, a lie collapsed, and pride met its punishment. Stay with me, because this story is not just about wealth. It's about who we see and who we overlook. Who was this woman really? Why did she allow herself to be humiliated? What kind of power hides behind silence? And most importantly, what happens when the mask finally falls, not with anger, but with truth? This is a story about love twisted by pride, about humility disguised as weakness, and about a man who mistook quiet for insignificance. How would you feel if someone you trusted treated you as invisible? What would you do if you had the power to expose them but chose to wait? These questions haunted one woman for months, and the answers she found changed everything. Before we continue deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Meet Daniel Carter. Daniel Carter believed success was loud. He spoke loudly, laughed loudly, and reminded people, often, that he was on the rise. He worked at Halston Global Holdings, a company so powerful it swallowed smaller firms without blinking. Daniel wasn't rich yet, but he wanted to look rich. Because in his world, appearance mattered more than truth. He lived in a downtown apartment he could barely afford, drove a leased BMW, and wore suits that cost more than his monthly rent. His colleagues saw ambition. His friends saw confidence. But underneath the expensive cologne and rehearsed handshake was a man terrified of being ordinary. Daniel had grown up watching his father work 3 jobs and still struggle to pay bills. He promised himself he would never live that way. So he crafted a version of himself that looked successful, sounded successful, and demanded to be treated as successful. The problem with masks is they require constant maintenance, and Daniel was exhausted from performing. Meet Evelyn Monroe. Evelyn Monroe believed power should be quiet. She walked softly, listened deeply, and rarely explained herself. She cleaned Daniel's apartment twice a week. At least, that's what Daniel thought. She arrived every Tuesday and Friday morning at 7, let herself in with the spare key he'd given her, and worked in silence while he got ready for the office. She never corrected him. Not when he tossed his shoes carelessly across the freshly mopped floor. Not when he complained about his stupid bosses who didn't recognize his brilliance. Not even when he said, "People like you don't understand pressure. You just clean and go home. I have to actually think for a living." Evelyn only smiled. Because some truths don't need defending, they need timing. What Daniel didn't know was that Evelyn Monroe had built Halston Global Holdings from a single struggling investment firm 23 years ago, turned it into a billion-dollar empire, and then quietly stepped back from public view after her husband passed away 5 years earlier. She had been mourning, healing, rediscovering who she was beyond boardrooms and quarterly reports. Her therapist suggested she do something simple, something grounding. So Evelyn started a small, private housekeeping service, taking on just a few clients. It wasn't about money. It was about being present in simple moments, about remembering that value isn't only measured in stock prices. When she knocked on Daniel's door 8 months ago, responding to his ad for a cleaning person, she had no idea who he was. But when he opened the door and said, "You'll do. I work at Halston Global, so I need discretion and professionalism," something flickered in her chest. Curiosity, maybe. Or perhaps the universe's sense of irony. she took the job. And week after week, she watched Daniel perform his life, never knowing he was performing for the woman who signed his paychecks. Would you have revealed yourself immediately? Or would you have waited to see who someone truly was when they thought you didn't matter? The invitation arrived on thick, cream-colored paper, embossed with gold lettering. Executive Appreciation Gala. Black tie. Halston Global Holdings requests the honor of your presence. Daniel held it like a golden ticket, because to him, that's exactly what it was. His boss would be there. Investors. Decision makers. The people who controlled his future. He'd heard rumors that the elusive founder, the mysterious woman who'd built the company, might actually attend this year. No one had seen her in years. Some employees didn't even know the company had been founded by a woman. They assumed it was just another corporation run by men in gray suits. Daniel saw opportunity everywhere he looked. But he needed an edge, something that would make him memorable, something that screamed success. And suddenly, watching Evelyn fold his laundry in the corner of his vision, an idea formed. It was twisted. Ugly, even. But Daniel had stopped listening to the part of himself that knew right from wrong. He'd silenced that voice months ago. He looked at Evelyn and said casually, "You'll come with me to the gala next Friday." She paused, a white shirt still in her hands, and turned slowly. "As what?" she asked gently, though she already knew. She could see it in his eyes, that particular gleam of someone about to use another human being as a prop. Daniel smirked, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "As my maid. As my help. I'll tell people you're my personal assistant or something. It'll make me look important. Like I'm the kind of guy who has staff, you know?" The room went silent except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Evelyn stood very still, and for a moment, Daniel saw something in her expression he couldn't quite name. Sadness, maybe. Or disappointment. But it passed quickly, replaced by that same gentle smile she always wore. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll come with you." Daniel felt a rush of victory. He didn't ask himself why she agreed so easily. He didn't wonder about her dignity or her feelings. He simply took her yes and ran with it, already imagining the impressed faces of his colleagues. And that was the moment the story crossed a line. Because Daniel thought he was using her. He thought he'd found a clever way to elevate himself by standing on someone else's back. But Evelyn was walking toward destiny, and she knew something Daniel didn't. She knew that truth has a way of arriving exactly when it's needed most. Over the next week, Daniel coached her. "Don't talk unless someone asks you a direct question. Stand slightly behind me. If anyone asks, say you've worked for me for a year. Make me look good." Each instruction landed like a small stone, and Evelyn collected them all without protest. She went to a department store and bought a simple black dress, plain and unremarkable. She'd wear no jewelry except her late husband's wedding ring, which she never removed. The night before the gala, she sat in her actual home, a 3-story brownstone in the historic district that Daniel had never seen, and asked herself one final time if she was doing the right thing. Her reflection in the mirror looked back calmly. Sometimes people need to meet the consequences of their choices. Sometimes the best teacher is reality itself. The gala shimmered with the kind of wealth that whispers instead of shouts. Men in tailored suits that cost more than most people's monthly salary moved through the grand ballroom like sharks in expensive fabric. Women draped in designer gowns and diamonds that caught the light with every movement laughed at jokes that weren't funny because the men telling them had power. The air smelled of imported roses, aged whiskey, and ambition. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their music barely audible over the hum of networking and deal-making. This was Daniel's dream. This was the world he'd been clawing toward his entire adult life. He arrived with Evelyn at 7:15, fashionably late but not too late. He'd rented a tuxedo he couldn't afford and spent an hour that afternoon getting his hair cut and styled. Evelyn walked beside him in her plain black dress, carrying a small purse, her hair pulled back simply. The contrast was exactly what Daniel wanted. Him, polished and ascending. Her, simple and serving. A visual representation of his manufactured success. They'd barely stepped into the ballroom when Daniel began his performance. He spotted a colleague from the finance department and steered Evelyn toward him. "Michael, good to see you. This is Evelyn, she's been with me for about a year now. Keeps my life organized, you know how it is." Michael nodded politely, barely glancing at Evelyn. She smiled gently and said nothing. Daniel felt a thrill of validation. It was working. He introduced her again and again as the evening progressed. "She's just my help. She manages my household. You know, personal staff, couldn't function without her." Some people laughed politely. Some barely looked at her. A few women in the room, other assistants and junior employees, caught Evelyn's eye with expressions of sympathy, recognizing a fellow servant in a room full of masters. But Evelyn absorbed every insult silently, every dismissive glance, every moment of invisibility. She didn't do it out of weakness. She did it because she was waiting. And she'd learned long ago that patience is a form of power most people never master. Can you imagine standing in a room full of people who don't see you, who look right through you as if you don't exist? How long could you bear it? But then something shifted. Evelyn noticed the board members whispering in a tight circle near the bar, checking their watches, glancing toward the entrance. She noticed the CEO, Richard Patterson, a man she'd known for 17 years, scanning the room with barely concealed anxiety. He was waiting for someone. The energy in the room began to change, a current of anticipation running through the crowd like electricity. An announcement was coming. Daniel grew nervous, though he didn't know why. He just felt it, that animal instinct that something was about to happen. He grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and downed half of it in one gulp. Evelyn stood beside him, hands folded, face calm. "Why is everyone acting weird?" Daniel muttered, more to himself than to her. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Perhaps they're waiting for someone important," she said softly. Daniel scoffed. "Everyone important is already here." Evelyn's lips curved into the smallest smile. "Perhaps," she said. And in that moment, if Daniel had been paying attention, if he'd been the kind of man who actually saw people, he might have noticed something in her eyes. Knowledge. Certainty. The quiet confidence of someone holding all the cards. Time stretched. The quartet finished their piece and took a break. The room's volume increased as people drank more and talked louder. Daniel was in the middle of telling an exaggerated story about a deal he'd barely contributed to when the lights dimmed slightly. A spotlight appeared, focused on a small stage at the front of the ballroom. The crowd quieted. Richard Patterson, the CEO, walked to the microphone, and the room fell completely silent. Daniel's heart raced. This was it. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. The founder was going to be introduced. The mysterious woman who'd built Halston Global from nothing. He'd heard she was ruthless, brilliant, impossible to impress. He straightened his bow tie and tried to position himself where she might see him, might notice him in the crowd. Evelyn remained still beside him, barely breathing. And Richard Patterson cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the hushed ballroom with absolute clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight is a special evening for all of us at Halston Global Holdings. For 5 years, we've operated with excellence and integrity, guided by the vision established by our founder. Many of you have never met her. She stepped back from public-facing leadership after the passing of her husband, choosing to guide the company from behind the scenes while she healed and rediscovered herself. But tonight, she has agreed to join us, to remind us all where we came from and where we're going. It is my profound honor to welcome the woman who built this company from a single struggling investment firm 23 years ago, who turned it into the global force it is today, who still owns 68% of all shares, and who remains the single most influential voice in every major decision we make. Richard paused, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on a figure in a plain black dress standing near the back. His face broke into a genuine smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, the founder and majority owner of Halston Global Holdings, Ms. Evelyn Monroe." The silence that followed was absolute. Not a glass clinked. Not a breath was heard. Every head turned, searching for the woman whose name had just been called. And then Evelyn stepped forward. 1 step. 2 steps. Moving through the crowd with the same quiet grace she'd shown while cleaning Daniel's apartment, while folding his shirts, while listening to him complain about bosses who didn't appreciate him. Except now, the crowd parted for her like water. Daniel's champagne glass slipped from his fingers, hitting the marble floor with a crash that echoed through the silent ballroom. His face went white. His mouth opened but no sound came out. Because the woman he'd called just my help, the woman he'd brought to make himself look important, the woman he'd instructed not to speak unless spoken to, was walking toward the stage. And everyone in the room, everyone except Daniel apparently, knew exactly who she was. Gasps rippled through the crowd, not because people didn't know Evelyn Monroe existed, but because she'd been here all along, standing quietly in a plain black dress while people ignored her. The irony was too perfect. The lesson too clear. Richard Patterson stepped down from the stage to meet her, offering his hand to help her up the 3 small steps. She took it with a grateful nod, her movements unhurried, her expression serene. When she reached the microphone, she stood there for a moment, looking out at the sea of faces. Some watched with admiration. Some with curiosity. A few of the assistants and lower-level employees looked at her with something like hope, as if her presence promised that quiet people could hold power too. And then there was Daniel, frozen near the back, his face a canvas of shock, humiliation, and dawning horror. Evelyn's eyes found his across the room. Not with anger. Not with triumph. But with something deeper. Sorrow, maybe. Disappointment that he'd revealed exactly who he was when he thought no one important was watching. She held his gaze for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours, and in that look, Daniel understood everything. Every careless word. Every dismissive gesture. Every moment he'd treated her as invisible. All of it had been witnessed by the one person whose opinion could destroy his career with a single word. "Good evening," Evelyn said, her voice soft but clear, carried by the microphone to every corner of the ballroom. "I know many of you have never seen me in person. I've preferred it that way for the past few years. After my husband James passed away, I needed time to remember who I was beyond this company. I needed to step back from the noise and rediscover simple truths." She paused, her fingers touching the wedding ring she still wore. "So I did something unusual. I started a small housekeeping service. I took on a few clients. I cleaned homes. I did laundry. I listened to people talk about their lives, their struggles, their dreams. And in doing something so simple, I learned more about human nature than I ever did in a boardroom." The crowd listened, transfixed. Some people's eyes widened as they began to understand. "I learned that people reveal their true character when they think you have no power over them. I learned that how someone treats a person they consider beneath them tells you everything you need to know about their soul. And I learned that the masks we wear, the versions of ourselves we perform, eventually crack under the weight of their own dishonesty."
David and Clara's story didn't end in that courtroom. It didn't end with Natalie's conviction. It's still being written every single day. In every soccer game David attends. In every bedtime story he reads. In every moment Clara feels safe enough to be herself. That's the real victory. Not over Natalie, but over the fear and trauma she tried to inflict. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of what really matters, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done differently if you were David? How would you help a child like Clara heal? And have you ever had to face a painful truth about someone you loved? Your perspective matters. Your story matters. And I read every single comment. If you stayed with me until the end, thank you. Thank you for caring about Clara's story. Thank you for being part of this community. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of our shared humanity, make sure you're subscribed. Because next week, I'm bringing you something you won't believe. A story about a woman who vanished on her wedding day and returned 5 years later with a truth that destroyed 3 families. You won't want to miss it. Until then, take care of each other. Protect the vulnerable. Love fiercely. And never, ever ignore your instincts when something feels wrong. Because sometimes, the people who need us most can't ask for help. They can only hope that someone is paying attention. Be that someone.
Evelyn's voice remained gentle, but every word landed with precision. This company was built on a simple principle. Treat people with dignity. All people. Not just those who can do something for you. Not just those with impressive titles or wealthy connections. All people. Because value isn't determined by job title or bank account. It's intrinsic. It's given at birth. And a company that forgets that will eventually collapse under the weight of its own cruelty. She let that sit for a moment before continuing. I met someone recently who works for this company. Someone ambitious and intelligent, someone with real potential. But also someone who had forgotten that basic principle. Someone who saw people as tools to be used, as props to elevate himself, as invisible when they couldn't offer him something. And watching that, I realized we have work to do. Not just as a company, but as people. Daniel wanted to run. Wanted to disappear. Wanted to rewind time to the moment he'd asked Evelyn to come with him and make a different choice. But he was frozen, pinned in place by shame and the eyes of colleagues who were starting to look his way, starting to understand. How would you feel in that moment? If your worst behavior was exposed not through accusation but through simple, undeniable truth? Evelyn concluded her speech with a promise to be more present in the company's operations, to ensure that its founding principles weren't just words on a mission statement but lived realities. The applause that followed was thunderous, genuine, the kind that comes from people truly moved by what they've heard. As she stepped down from the stage, people approached her with respect, with warmth, with stories of how the company had changed their lives. Richard Patterson stood beside her, beaming with pride, occasionally leaning in to whisper names and context. And through it all, Evelyn remained gracious, present, real. Daniel tried to leave. He made it to the coat check before his legs gave out and he had to sit on a velvet bench in the lobby, head in his hands. The weight of his humiliation was crushing. Not because Evelyn had exposed him publicly, she hadn't mentioned his name or pointed him out. But because he'd exposed himself. Every person he'd introduced Evelyn to that night now knew. Every colleague who'd heard him say, "She's just my help," now understood what that revealed about him. The mask had cracked, and underneath it was something small and desperate and deeply ashamed. He sat there for 20 minutes before Evelyn found him. She'd changed out of her gala posture and back into the gentle quietness he recognized from his apartment. She sat beside him on the bench, maintaining a respectful distance. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel managed to whisper, "Why didn't you tell me?" Evelyn considered the question carefully. "Would you have heard me if I had? Or would you have just seen it as a crazy claim from someone you'd already decided didn't matter?" The truth of that landed like a punch. Daniel had no answer because they both knew she was right. "I never lied to you, Daniel," Evelyn continued, her voice still gentle. "You asked if I did housekeeping. I said yes. You assumed that was all I did. You assumed that was all I was. I simply let people reveal who they truly were when they thought I couldn't affect their lives. And you revealed yourself completely." Daniel's throat tightened. "I'm sorry," he managed, and for the first time in years, he meant it. Not sorry he'd been caught. Sorry for who he'd become. The person who could look at another human being and see only utility. The person who'd traded his integrity for the appearance of success. Evelyn nodded slowly. I believe you are. Right now, in this moment, sitting in the ashes of your own making, you're genuinely sorry. The question is whether that sorrow will last. Whether it will change you. Or whether you'll simply rebuild the mask and be more careful about who might be watching. She stood, smoothing her plain black dress. You have real talent, Daniel. I've seen your work. You're intelligent and capable. But talent without character is just noise. And our company has enough noise. She began to walk away, then paused and turned back. I'm not going to fire you. I'm not going to ruin your career. That's not who I am. But I suspect you'll make your own decision about whether you can continue working somewhere that now knows who you are underneath the performance. Either way, I hope you find yourself the real version. Because that person, whoever they are, deserves better than this half-life you've been living. And then she was gone, leaving Daniel alone with the truth. He didn't return to work the following Monday. Or the Monday after that. 2 weeks later, a brief resignation letter arrived at HR, professional, gracious, citing a need to pursue other opportunities. No drama. No blame. Just a quiet exit from a man who finally understood he needed to rebuild himself from the foundation up. Did Evelyn accept his resignation? Yes. Did she think about him afterward? Sometimes. Not with anger, but with hope that his humiliation had been the kind that breaks someone open rather than breaks them down. 6 months later, Daniel was working at a much smaller firm for less money, living in a modest apartment he could actually afford, driving a used car. The performance had stopped. He said please and thank you to people whose names he actually learned. He asked the janitor in his building about his family. He left bigger tips and smaller impressions. And slowly, quietly, he started to become someone he could respect when he looked in the mirror. Would that have been enough for you? If you'd been humiliated the way Daniel was, could you have used it to grow? Or would shame have hardened into resentment? Evelyn Monroe continued to lead Halston Global Holdings with the same quiet strength she'd always possessed. But she was more visible now, attending quarterly meetings, mentoring young employees, especially women and people from backgrounds that made them feel invisible in corporate spaces. She never told Daniel's story publicly. She didn't need to. The lesson had already rippled through the company. Treat people with dignity. All people. Always. Because you never know who's watching. And more importantly, because it's simply the right thing to do. Power doesn't shout. It doesn't need to explain itself or prove itself to those who've already decided not to see. Power chooses silence when silence serves truth. And it speaks only when speaking can change something. This story asks us uncomfortable questions. How many people have we dismissed because they didn't look important? How many times have we performed a version of ourselves that requires treating others as less than? What would happen if the masks fell and we had to meet the truth of who we've been? Never underestimate quiet people. Some carry storms behind their calm. Some hold empires in their gentle hands. Some know exactly who they are and don't need your validation to prove it. The world is loud. It rewards performance. It celebrates those who shout their value from rooftops. But underneath all that noise, there's a different kind of power. The power of knowing yourself so completely that other people's opinions can't shake you. The power of treating everyone with dignity, not because of what they can do for you, but because that's who you've decided to be. The power of letting truth arrive in its own time rather than forcing it. Evelyn Monroe embodied that power. And in doing so, she taught everyone who witnessed that gala a lesson they'd never forget. Who you are when no one important is watching is who you actually are. Everything else is just performance. And eventually, inevitably, the curtain falls. So I ask you now, what would you have done in Evelyn's place? Would you have revealed the truth sooner, the moment Daniel suggested you come as his maid? Or would you have waited, like she did, to let him fully reveal himself? And if you were Daniel, could you have rebuilt yourself after such complete humiliation? Or would the shame have been too heavy to carry toward growth? Do you believe humility is strength, or is the world too loud to notice the quiet ones? Have you ever been underestimated, looked through, treated as if you didn't matter? How did that feel? And have you ever been the one doing the underestimating, dismissing someone because they didn't seem important enough to see? These are the questions this story leaves us with. If this story touched something in you, if it made you uncomfortable or hopeful or reflective, subscribe for more stories that remind us who we are and who we should never overlook. Kindly subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what this story made you feel. Because the next story will challenge everything you think you know about justice, fate, and the price of choosing appearance over authenticity. Until then, remember that everyone you meet is carrying a story you know nothing about. Treat them accordingly.